Nighttime in Afghanistan, a remote and heavily fortified base that is home to an elite unit of American Special Forces in a land from which Osama bin Laden launched the 9/11 attacks against the United States. Good evening. Almost 4 years after 9/11, how's the war on terror going? Osama bin Laden is still at large. Why is that? Across the border in Pakistan, are they doing enough? In Saudi Arabia, the land of Osama bin Laden's birth, the new realities in their war against terror. At the CIA and the other American intelligence agencies, after 4 years of turmoil, are they better or worse? Tonight, I'll take you to the highest echelons and deep inside the war on terror. These are pictures taken last month from what has been called the Forgotten War, the war in Afghanistan. These Marines are on the hunt for a man they suspect of killing 2 American servicemen.
Just search for personnel. I don't want you tearing these houses apart.
And now, in a show of force, the Marines are demanding answers, convinced that Afghan villagers are protecting the suspect.
Try and get something out of him.
But ask him if he has any idea what's going on in this area from anybody.
On this day, the Marines can't find their man, and they retreat. It is a scene so much like the broader war on terror, the often frustrating search for a dangerous but mostly invisible enemy.
It makes it all the more difficult to deal with because you're not quite sure where to go, where to look. And obviously we don't want surprises, so we have to look everywhere all the time, and that is stressful.
Porter Goss is the new director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which was widely criticized for failing to anticipate the 9/11 attacks that killed almost 3,000 people. In his first network television interview, Goss told us what he believes it will now take to keep America safe.
You have to get to the terrorists before they get to you. Defense alone will not win. So you have to take the offense. You have to go to the enemy in this.
And the enemy is not in a central location. The CIA director calls it the Belt of Terror, extending from the Philippines and East Asia, across Indonesia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, through Iraq and the Middle East, and into West Africa and Western Europe. Who knows how many sleeper cells of terrorists are in this country, prepared to launch another 9/11-style attack on America? Just as terrorists stunned Spain when they launched carefully orchestrated train bombings that killed almost 200 people in Madrid last year. So, 4 years after the 9/11 attacks, the war on terror is a global effort. A shooting war, a war of intel, intelligence, and a war of psyops, psychological operations, all of it costing hundreds of billions of dollars a year. One of the earliest pitched battles in the war on terror was in the majestic Tora Bora Mountains of Afghanistan.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes.
In October of 2001, a month after the September 11th terrorist attacks, the CIA led a successful unconventional war against the Taliban government of Afghanistan, which had allowed Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda to use that country as a launching pad for its terrorists. Today, there are still some 18,000 American troops on the ground in Afghanistan in this forgotten war, and the fight against terrorists has intensified again this spring and summer. In those first few months of the war, bin Laden was thought to be cornered in the Tora Bora region. But American military officials on the ground decided local warlords should lead the effort to capture or kill him. They failed, and bin Laden escaped. Now, almost 4 years later, bin Laden is still believed to be hiding somewhere in the wild country between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Over that ridge line and over a couple of more ridge lines is Pakistan. But before you get to Pakistan, you have the tribal regions. Probably Osama bin Laden is somewhere in there. Do you ever think about him?
Honestly, he's not my focus. My focus is this valley and the next valley and the villages that we can influence. I think by starting it with the populace and separating the insurgents from the populace, then we'll take away that power base that Osama and his associates have.
Although he is rarely mentioned these days by American soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan or even by Bush administration officials back in Washington, Osama bin Laden remains public enemy number one. Lieutenant General David Barno was the overall commander of the American forces in Afghanistan for 18 months. Why is he so tough to find and bring down?
Well, he's one person in an area, a border area that's about 1,500 miles, about the distance from Washington, D.C. to Denver, Colorado, covered by the Rocky Mountains the whole way. So finding a single person in that structure here in a very tribal society, a very remote society in many ways, is a pretty big challenge, but we're going to stay on it until we're successful.
If they are successful, they're going to need the help of this man, President Pervez Musharraf, the general who presides over Pakistan's large, volatile Islamic population. Musharraf told us he has 75,000 troops hunting bin Laden in the tribal areas of Pakistan bordering Afghanistan, but he forbids American troops from operating in Pakistan. It's widely believed that Osama bin Laden and the other senior members of al-Qaeda are in the so-called tribal regions, and that they're protected in part by the sympathetic attitudes of some of the Pakistani army units that are there.
I would suggest that that's pretty much sanctuary area for the terrorists, and I'm not sure it's an area that's fully under control of the Pakistani military.
Should the Pakistanis allow American units, including some of your own, to come in from Afghanistan into those areas?
That would be obviously a Pakistan sovereign issue, and that would be better put to President Musharraf.
Musharraf has a tough job, working closely with the Americans at the risk of triggering a political explosion in his own country. He's already been the target of 2 close assassination attempts. Is there a danger for you personally and for your government that if Pakistani troops take down Osama bin Laden in what would probably be a difficult struggle, it would cause an uprising in some of the cities in your country and in the refugee camps?
Well, there will be effects, but we shouldn't be so naive as to capture him and then go around telling everyone and going around with him everywhere. I mean, there is a method of dealing with the situation.
But it would be delicate, wouldn't it?
It will be certainly delicate, not only here, but even in the Islamic world.
If Musharraf is killed, it would be disastrous. Roger Cressy, President Bush's former deputy director of counterterrorism, now an NBC News analyst.
Our greatest fear when I was in government was that Musharraf's government would be overthrown, and you'd have a radical Islamist taking over, one who's sympathetic to al-Qaeda and has a capability to access nuclear technology. That's the great nightmare.
And so Pakistan has received more than $2 billion from the United States since 9/11, half of it to fight the terror war. And there have been notable successes against al-Qaeda.
We have almost eliminated them from our cities. We've seized all their bases which were in the valleys, their sanctuaries which they were using as their command bases, their logistic bases, their propaganda bases. We got truckloads of discs and CDs and computers. They are now on the run in small packets in the mountains. So therefore they cease to exist as a well-coordinated body.
Is that because of bold moves by Musharraf, his army, and special forces? Or does the United States have a much larger role than either side can or will acknowledge? Pakistan's major cities, such as Rawalpindi, are crowded, chaotic affairs, and yet more major al-Qaeda figures have been arrested in the cities than in the countryside, including the notorious Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Remember this picture, the night that he was arrested in early 2003? Top American intelligence officials tell NBC News that the CIA had a mole in Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's inner circle. And one night, the informer saw where he would be spending the evening. So he let his American handlers know, and they, with some help from the Pakistanis, moved in and grabbed him in the middle of the night. Just this spring, another top al-Qaeda leader, Abu Faraj al-Libi, was captured in joint U.S.-Pakistani actions. Despite the successful captures in Pakistan, no one believes the terrorist threat has gone away. And now more than ever, experts are convinced it won't disappear even if bin Laden is brought to justice. Ironically, one of the most dangerous places, a breeding ground for terrorism, is also considered to be one of America's staunchest allies in the war on terror. The shooting part of the global war on terror began when the United States went into Afghanistan. But for the terrorists, The ideological center of their rage was here, in Saudi Arabia. Of the 19 young men who hijacked the 4 American passenger planes on 9/11, 15 of them were from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia remains a primary source of terrorists. It's estimated that almost half of the suicide bombers operating in the Iraqi insurgency are from Saudi Arabia. Between mid-2003 and the end of 2004, terrorists inside Saudi Arabia itself launched 6 separate attacks against Saudi targets, killing 102 people. In one attack, militant supporters of Osama bin Laden used explosives and blasted their way into the U.S. consulate in the Saudi city of Jeddah. 8 people died. Until that began to happen to them, many Saudi officials were in denial about terror in their own country. Then, they decided to take action.
Osama bin Laden has said that he is motivated in al-Qaeda to strike back, even at his own country and at the West, because of what he says is the presence of the infidels in Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War and the continuing relationship between your country and the West.
If there is anybody who has done more damage to Islam, to be considered an infidel, it is Osama bin Laden and nobody else.
Prince Saud Al Faisal, a member of the royal family, has been the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia for 30 years.
Does he still have standing in Saudi Arabia? If I went to the rural areas and talked to the young men there, I've been told that many would still find him heroic.
I think you would find a tremendous change in Saudi Arabia and that. And what they have done in Saudi Arabia, killing the innocents, indiscriminately acting against everybody, has lost them any kind of support that they had in the past.
This building, right in the heart of the Saudi capital in Riyadh, was the target of an enormous truck bomb explosion in December 2003. 5 people were killed. Saudi officials have decided to keep it in this state as a reminder to the citizens of this country of the very high price of terrorism. Since then, the Saudis have launched a national television campaign against terror, and anti-terrorism billboards line the streets. After each incident of terrorism, police collect DNA samples and take them to the state-of-the-art crime lab. What do you hear when a terror suspect is presented with the evidence? Yeah, we have your DNA, this crime scene, this crime scene, this crime scene.
He will be shocked.
Yeah.
Yes.
They know that they're cooked.
Right. They know they're followed. They're in trouble, so they will
start to cooperate.
Start cooperating and saying everything.
But for all of their tough talk and new laws, it is difficult to assess exactly how successful the Saudi war on terrorism has been. It remains a highly secret society. Our movements within Saudi Arabia were closely monitored. Saudi special forces accompanied us everywhere, and every request for an interview was made through the Saudi government. Nonetheless, Sherard Cooper-Coles, the British ambassador to Saudi Arabia, an Arab expert, is encouraged. Mr. Ambassador, it took the Saudis a while to acknowledge the depth of the problem that they had, even at home, with terrorism. What's your evaluation of how they're doing now?
Well, the bad news is that this is a chronic and serious problem. It's going to take years to solve, and I think the Saudi authorities will be the first to recognize that. But the good news is they've conducted a really pretty effective counter-terrorist campaign. They've disrupted the al-Qaeda network here. They've taken it down, and the terrorists are on the back foot.
Since beginning their crackdown on terrorism, the Saudis have rounded up most of the major suspects on their most wanted list. For a time, American authorities were worried that they were killing too many of those suspects in the initial ferocious gunfights. Lately, the Saudis have been taking more prisoners. They've been getting more intelligence out of them, and they're also trying to persuade them to change their ways.
He could zoom in and he can read a license plate number.
Saudi General Mansour al-Turki helps run the counterterrorism operations for Saudi Arabia. This is the first time Western media have been permitted inside. Experts outside of Saudi Arabia say sometimes you kill too many of them, you should take more prisoners and learn more from them.
Well, we have enough prisoners of them. We have killed all of those who refused to surrender, actually, when we asked them. We gave them a chance. We always ask them to throw their guns. But these people are actually insisting most of the time to fight until the last minute. So nothing we can help it about that.
The fight against terror goes beyond guns and police raids. Students at the school were involved in an art project demonstrating the horrors of terrorism, and everyone at the school involved seemed determined to show that terror is an outrage, alien to the true Saudi Islamic way of life. But the hard truth is, the attacks in Saudi Arabia were carried out by Saudis, presumably some of them under the influence of Saudi clerics. Just 3 months ago, NBC's Lisa Meyer spoke to Saudi clerics who were preaching that young people should cross the border into Iraq and join jihad against the United States.
I praise the jihad against the occupiers in Iraq. Throats must be slit and skulls must be shattered.
This huge demonstration.
Richard Engel has spent 2 years covering the war in Iraq for NBC News.
There are people coming in from other countries that are joining up to this very domestic conflict in Iraq and disguising themselves among it. But it is an engine driving the antagonism toward the United States, and it's also an active conflict that Al-Qaeda and other groups have been able to latch onto to continue their own war against America.
During an interview this month in western Iraq, this militant insurgent, loyal to Al-Qaeda, explained why he wants to die trying to expel American troops from what he calls the illegal occupation of Iraq.
The answer to this question is from a legitimate Islamic viewpoint. God Almighty has imposed on the believers to fight infidels wherever they are and to confront them. I, as a believer and a Muslim from the land of Mesopotamia, refuse all other options and am committed to only one choice, which is, only by this will the stolen rights be returned to the people.
The Islamic extremist rage against the United States has not been extinguished, has it?
Absolutely not. People point to Iraq constantly as saying, look at what America did to this country. It was not a pleasant country before under Saddam Hussein, but it is certainly not a model place to live right now, and that's clear for people to see around the Arab world.
You've been living in this part of the world for some time now. What's the underlying source of all this rage against Western ideals, the things that we cherish?
It's mostly Islamic. People believe as a baseline assumption that there is an American agenda against Islam, and then it gets more conspiratorial from there. But people generally assume that the U.S. policy is linked to an Israeli vision to dominate Islam. That is the basis for a lot of the frustration and anger that you have across the region.
If it ever happens, the capture of Osama bin Laden may be nothing more than a symbolic victory. Just as the arrest of Saddam Hussein in Iraq 18 months ago did not end the insurgency there, those in diplomatic and intelligence circles say getting Osama bin Laden won't end the threat from Al-Qaeda or other like-minded terror groups. This is a rare look inside the CIA Operations Center in Langley, Virginia, where terrorist activities are tracked 24/7. Phil Mudd, a career CIA analyst, is the agency's principal expert on terrorism. For an outsider looking in, it appears that Al-Qaeda's central command and control has been greatly diffused. Does it make it harder for you to find out what's going on out there?
I think in some ways it does. When you look at, one of the few advantages of working against an organization as capable as Al-Qaeda, we had a hierarchy in a central node that we could go against. What we now have is, in a sense, a localization of groups, a localization of the threat. So in some ways it does make it more difficult to chase the target. In other ways, though, the advantage that gives us is that we're fighting groups in some ways that don't have the strategic capabilities of Al-Qaeda. So advantages in some areas, I think disadvantages in others.
I know that we've been effective in taking down a lot of the top leadership of Al-Qaeda. But there does appear to be an unending stream of young fighters willing to join jihad against the United States. Is this a war without end?
No, I don't quite see it that way. We've crippled the enemy that conducted the attacks of September 11th. The way forward, though, is not really with that enemy. It's with enemies that are now coming up and emerging. I think we can make progress in in that regard, destroying these networks, but I do think it'll take years and in some cases decades.
Last year's bombing in Madrid by a group loosely connected to al-Qaeda was a deadly reminder that terror isn't confined to the Middle East or American targets. Next door to Spain, the French have an aggressive anti-terror campaign underway. In America, the public perception may be that France and the United States are in a political war over Iraq. The fact is, when it comes to fighting terror and sharing intelligence, these two countries are working hand in hand at the top, and they have been for some time. Prosecuting Judge Jean-Louis Bruyère is a leading French official in the war on terror.
The people who are joining the terror movement, are they coming from different areas now than just the Middle East?
Yes, different areas. Not, different areas.
But are they coming from Indonesia and Southeast Asia, Africa?
Yes. We have detected cells from France in all the parts of the world, in Australia, in Japan, in South Korea, in Africa, in United States, in Caucasus area, in Russia, everywhere.
Judge Bruyère is in close contact with his American counterparts. He says he communicates with them every day.
I think the intelligence community, historically and particularly now in the war on terrorism, is working cooperatively. There is no sovereign nation that really wants to have terrorists running around in their country killing innocent people.
That may be so, but some countries are cooperating more than others. When the United States began bombing Afghanistan in October of 2001, some al-Qaeda leaders fled to Iran, according to former and current CIA officials. The United States has long accused Iran of sponsoring terrorism. This is Tehran, the capital of Iran, and behind those green gates, the old American embassy, taken over, of course, by student militants here in 1979. Now, a unit of the Revolutionary Guard is headquartered there, hidden from public view. Also hidden from public view in this country, several senior members of Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda. Again this spring, Iranian authorities said in the local press that they are holding them and that the investigation continues and they may be tried in Iranian courts. American authorities would like to know who they're holding and where.
Well, who do you think they have?
We believe that they have significant members of al-Qaeda's management council going back to pre-9/11.
Frances Townsend is the president's advisor on counterterrorism and homeland security. She's responsible for coordinating America's efforts to combat terrorism.
The Iranians are not telling us who they have, and they're not talking about what, if anything, what progress, if any, has been made in terms of their investigation.
Well, many have been arrested and detained. Getting terror suspects into court has been a slow process, not only in Iran, but in the West, including the United States. The only person charged for the 9/11 attacks in the United States was Zacarias Moussaoui. He pleaded guilty to terrorist activity, but denied any involvement in the 9/11 hijackings. There is a 9/11 attack trial underway in Hamburg, Germany, but the proceedings have been long and frustrating for this man, Dominic Pupolo. His mother was on American Airlines Flight 11 when it crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. For some people, they just don't want to go back to the horrors of that. But for you, it is the very horror of that that keeps you involved in it.
I promised my mother shortly after she was killed on 9/11 that someday I would find afford her justice.
Pupolo recently visited the site of the former World Trade Center, Ground Zero, and for the first time he found his mother's name on the list of victims there. He has spent the better part of a year helping German prosecutors make their case against Munir el-Motassadik, who is standing trial for allegedly helping hijacker Mohammed Atta plot the 9/11 attacks. Motassadik admits he was friendly with the hijacker, but he denies any personal involvement in the 9/11 plot.
It's quite hard to be sitting across the room from him. It requires enormous restraint.
Pupolo, on crutches during the trial because of a broken foot, believes his presence in the courtroom will help persuade the tribunal of 5 German judges to convict Motassadik. An earlier conviction was overturned. So, for the time being, Motassadik is a free man, and Pupolo is now out of money. He spent all the money he received from the Victims' Compensation Fund and an inheritance from his mother, a total of $200,000, to pay German lawyers and translators to cover the cost of moving to Germany for the trial.
It has proven to be a much greater challenge than I ever imagined. I'm there for a purpose, and the purpose is to not let this man walk away free.
But he may.
And that's something I'm willing to accept, but I'm working very hard to make sure that does not happen. So the Motazek trial, for me, has much more meaning than just his particular trial and his particular involvement.
It's a symbol.
It's a symbol of a process that's bigger, and it shows that we are a nation, a civilized society, and that we're going to follow and obey the rule of law. We don't want to stoop to the level of the terrorist.
Even so, some experts worry U.S. interrogation tactics and the emphasis on the military part of the war on terror could be counterproductive, alienating the very people it needs to reach to win the war.
We have a messenger versus message problem. The message that the administration is articulating about greater political openness, the need for a number of governments to deal with the socioeconomic problems in the Middle East and elsewhere is right on. The problem is the messenger is not trusted.
4 years after 9/11, this is the hard, dangerous work of the war on terror, going after the bad guys with guns and raids, the lethal approach. Yet winning the war on terror is not measured just in body counts or suspects in jail. In the final analysis, winning the confidence and trust of the Islamic world is equally important at this stage, maybe even more important. That dual mission is on display in a remote river valley of southeastern Afghanistan. It's been a routine of fight one day, try to win friends among the locals the next day for these American Special Forces. This Army Special Forces captain, who cannot be identified for security reasons, is a Mormon from Utah. While at West Point, he interrupted his academy studies to do Mormon mission work in Brazil.
Do you feel like you're doing something in a missionary sense here as well?
I think so, sir. Yeah, it's an interesting way to put it, but I think democracy and freedom, those types of ideas are definitely opening people's minds.
These are the minds the captain, his men, and units of the new Afghan army are trying to win. Wary villagers, the male elders who have formed an impromptu jirga, a kind of town meeting.
Should there be more Americans here, or should they go away? Go home?
They don't want any more to come.
Oh, they want.
When these people who are present, they are okay.
They're okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Afghanistan is going to be a different country because of your elections, and young women now will have a role in the government. Is that a good idea?
The steps is allowed by God and by messenger and also by the government. We love that. We like that.
So it will be a change for Afghan women. This little girl can grow up maybe to be an elder in the village.
If God gave her that power, I don't have any problem with that.
Does anyone here talk about Osama bin Laden?
We don't have any knowledge about him. They use bad words for him.
You won't tell me what the bad words are, though.
It's like.
That's a bad word. Okay.
Oh, you want some candy, don't you?
These villagers are agreeable while we're there, but reserved. After all they've been through, who can blame them?
You want to align your rear sight with your front sight.
So the American Special Forces are trying to put an Afghan face on security in this area, training the new Afghan army, hiring local villagers for construction projects, building schools. So far for boys only, the villagers won't send their daughters.
But because of this rugged terrain and their small numbers, they've only been able to secure an area about 3 miles around.
So even as U.S. troops struggle to win hearts and minds, they still have a daunting military challenge in Afghanistan. Taliban attacks have actually increased sharply in the last month. And last week, the State Department confirmed there was an assassination plot against the outgoing American ambassador, Zalmay Khalilzad. And throughout the Muslim region, The American campaign to win favor with the people is made much more difficult by widespread poverty and illiteracy, by the absence of political reform, conditions which can breed terrorism. That's the case in Pakistan.
There's no social justice here, and there is no democracy.
Pervez Hoodboy is a professor of physics at a Pakistan university in Islamabad. He's well known for his outspoken views about the dangers of religious extremism in Pakistan.
Are you saying that if things don't change in Pakistan internally and in its relationship with the United States, there's a danger that this country could become another Iran within not so many years?
Iran will appear minor. Iran was 35-40 million people at the time of the revolution. Pakistan right now is 150 million people, with 70% of the population being under the age of 16. In 25 years from now, it will be 250 million people. That's 250 million people. And of those 250 million, the kids will be the overwhelming majority, and those will be kids who have been brought up, nurtured on the ideas of jihad and martyrdom.
To counter that, the United States has spent $60 million on a television network designed to promote democracy and freedom in the Middle East. But it's Al Jazeera and the other Arab all-news cable outlets that people in the region watch. And the anti-American coverage adds to suspicions about American motives. Images such as these, American soldiers humiliating Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib, have overwhelmed any positive message the United States has been trying to deliver to the Muslim world. Guantanamo Bay, where the United States is holding more than 500 terror suspects without charging or trying them, also has become a hot button in the Arab world. There have been allegations of prisoner abuse at Guantanamo Bay, and the Pentagon released a report saying the Muslim holy book, the Quran, had been abused as well.
Guantanamo, is it worth the price? Do you have to change the debate, given how it's inflamed such a large part of the Islamic world?
The answer is the people who are at Guantanamo, we've released or returned those that we can, those that are not enemy combatants. The people that are there are really bad people, and if they are released, they will go back into the theater and they will kill and try to harm U.S. and multinational forces. They cannot be released.
Even if the United States can prove that Muslim prisoners at Guantanamo are well treated, to America's critics, the administration motives can appear confusing, even hypocritical. Although recently Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice has been pushing America's allies in the Muslim world to promote democracy, the United States since 9/11 has supported the quasi-military regime in Pakistan and has long supported the repressive monarchy in Saudi Arabia.
The lack of political openness in Saudi Arabia creates this incubator that the radical Islamists tap into. It's anger and it's frustration. And until they come to grips with that, you're still going to have a growing radical Islamist presence inside the House of Saud.
What are the biggest misconceptions about your part of the world that Americans still have when you encounter them?
I think the understanding of Islam, understanding of Arabs.
Perhaps no one has a better idea what the United States needs to do to bridge the Gulf with the Muslim world than this man, Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. He's the single largest foreign investor in the United States, the fourth richest man in the world, and a devout Muslim.
Look at that. You have your own waterfall and your own Grand Canyon here.
He was the only Saudi that we spoke to whose interview was not set up by the government.
A lot of young Muslims, not just in Saudi Arabia, but throughout the Islamic world, don't have job opportunities, not enough opportunities for education like you had, and are frustrated by the absence of political reform. They don't have a voice in their own countries, and that fuels a rage as well. What were the roots of the anti-Americanism? Was it jealousy? Was it our sense of entitlement in the United States?
I don't believe it's jealousy. There's a syndrome in the Islamic world, the sentiment of being anti-America, this imperialism that took place, this blatant pro-Israel stand, it's just not, people don't like it.
You hear it wherever you go in the Middle East, the strong American relationship with Israel. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has long been a flashpoint in that part of the world, and one of the underlying causes of the hostility that Arab countries feel toward the United States.
If there is some progress between the Israelis and the Palestinians, how will that alter
some of that rage.
It would certainly go a long way to convincing people of American good intentions toward the region. People do not think that the U.S. has just or honorable intentions toward Muslims or the Arab world. It would do a lot to convince people that Americans do really have the interests of the people in the region in mind.
Even though there have been no major terrorist attacks here since 9/11, counter-terrorist experts worry al-Qaeda sympathizers are plotting future attacks on U.S. soil. Just this month, a Pakistani father and son living near Sacramento, California, were charged with lying to the FBI about a trip the son reportedly took to an al-Qaeda terrorist training camp. The family denies the charges. Frances Townsend was appointed a year ago as the president's advisor on Homeland Security and counterterrorism. She's responsible for coordinating America's efforts to combat terrorism.
How much do we know about the people who may have come into this country determined to do great harm to it, who are out there waiting for the opportunity to strike?
The answer is, if someone is absolutely determined to infiltrate this country and to hide and take advantage, frankly, of our freedoms and our liberties, they're going to do that. We fight against their ability to exploit that. It's very difficult.
What's your best judgment about the sleeper cell threat? Low, middle, or high?
I would say middle. I think we work very hard against it, and I don't think that threat has diminished. I think our enemies have been very clear that they would like to hit us again inside the United States.
To avoid that, the 9/11 Commission report recommended a series of changes to improve national security, but many say America still is vulnerable.
Let me tell you what I worry about. I go through an airport magnetometer, take off my shoes, take off my belt, take off my jacket, get put in the other area to get the extra inspection. And the whole time I'm thinking, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of container ships coming into this country every week at ports from the West Coast to the East Coast with no inspection.
We have more to do, but I think it's unfair to say that they're not, the ports and containers that you referred to have got no inspection. We do have inspectors at foreign ports, so we're looking at targeting those containers before they come to the United States. We actually have a pretty comprehensive program. Is it flawless? Absolutely not.
The 9/11 Commission was also critical of how communications broke down between law enforcement agencies, and that contributed to the 9/11 attacks. The Commission recommended the appointment of an intelligence czar to oversee all 15 intelligence agencies. John Negroponte was appointed as National Intelligence Director in April.
And at the end of the day, who determines the efficiency of the various operations that we have underway around the world? Because that's where the rubber meets the road, isn't it?
That's right. And I will tell you, it's rarely a single, what you want me to say is there's this one person behind this one desk. And
no, I think the country wants and really deserves to know how the system now works, because we discovered that the old system didn't work very well. There was a scramble to put together a new one, and a lot of people have questions about whether we have too many agencies now and not lines of authority that are really as clear as they need to be.
Well, I would say to you, oftentimes operations that we take involve more than one agency. That's why it's not a simple answer. When you look at the Pak-Afghan border, there are military forces, there are CIA operatives, and they work as a single team, an integrated unit. And we found that that's where we get our strength, leveraging all instruments of national power, not using just one tool in the toolkit, but using them all. Ultimately, the person who makes the judgment with whether they're satisfied with effectiveness is the President of the United States.
Any number of people believe that the insurgency in Iraq, which has continued unabated for a long time now, has simply become basic training for jihad against the United States and against other Western nations, for that matter.
I think many of the tactics you see inside Iraq are tactics you've seen by terrorists around the world in different countries. You look at vehicle-borne explosive devices. You look at remote-controlled detonation devices. Iraq isn't the only place you see them being used.
But they're going against the United States military. That's being broadcast by Al Jazeera and other all-Arab cable news outlets. That becomes a kind of catalyst around the world. That's been pretty clearly demonstrated at this point in Islamic societies, where young radicals then get motivated.
Well, the question of countering the ideological support for terrorism is a very serious one. And the fact is, what we need to do is undermine this notion of ideological support to terror in the same way that we undermined the notion of slavery being acceptable, or Nazism, or fascism. the notion of terrorism as a legitimate technique must be undermined.
Will we see the end of this war in the next 5 years?
You know, people ask me, I have two small little boys, and people say, how can you work the hours you work and be away from your family? And I tell them, I fight today in the hopes that my children won't have to fight when they're in these positions.
Ground Zero in New York, the great open wound in lower Manhattan that reminds us still of a terror attack that brought so much death, grief, and anger. The war on terror had been underway before 9/11 as a result of earlier attacks on American embassies, a military barracks, and a warship. But it was a low-key, part-time war. 9/11 changed that. And for almost 4 years, it has been a full-time war with a mixed record of great successes measured against setbacks and miscalculations. America has been free of attacks since 9/11, and for some, that is a sign that the worst is over. But no expert we talk to believes that. They believe it is a long war, and it is a long way from being over. I'm Tom Brokaw. Good night from Ground Zero.